So we're going to go ahead and get started. I think, people are going to keep trickling in, but we have so much to cover in so little time, and we want to make sure we get to all of it. So I want to welcome everyone to the session. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk a lot about women in the workforce today. We are going to sit there and talk about frontline workers. We're going to talk about workers of color. We're going to talk about everyone and anyone that, is sitting there and dealing with the number of challenges that we've had to face during the pandemic and, of course, in this post-pandemic world that we find ourselves in. So before we get too far into it, I want to have everyone introduce themselves, and I want you guys to answer kind of the question around how you got into this work and why are you doing it? Why does it matter now? So I'll start immediately to my left, put you on the hot spot.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tyra Mariani. I am president of the Schultz Family Foundation based in Seattle. And why did I get into this work? I'm a woman. I identify as a woman. I identify as a woman of color in particular. And I think when you care about equity, you care about all underrepresented populations, and you care about all people who may not be experiencing equity in the workplace. And so as one who started my career in a male-dominant environment, consulting in particular, this became, the disparities became clear to me very early on. And even in my role at the Schultz Foundation, being a woman who is underrepresented from a leadership perspective, it continues to be acute of what the differences are in navigating those, and so that's kind of how I show up.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mega Bunsel-Rizzoli, pronouns she, her. I'm a director at Jobs for the Future. So much of what you actually shared is also very resonant. I'm a woman of color, and also career in consulting, where I found amazing opportunities, but often ones that didn't necessarily match the career path I was architecting for myself. I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me in some of those positions, and I'm seeing head nods in the room. So that's a little bit of it. I'll share a quick personal story about why this moment, why now. Last year, when the decision was leaked from Roe v. Wade, it hit me hard. It was the week that I found out I was having a baby girl. I'm going to tear up. And it really mattered to me. It was not the world that I wanted to bring my daughter into, and it really just motivated me to try and think about what are we doing and how can we really drive and have employers be showing up on topics that affect real lives. So that's my why now, right? She is my why now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Hagan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm first vice president of social impact banking at Amalgamated Bank. I actually come out of working in reproductive health advocacy. No one is more surprised to be a banker than myself. But I ended up doing this because while I was working in reproductive health, my nonprofit actually honored Amalgamated Bank as the only bank, probably over 10 years ago now, that was willing to help reopen an abortion clinic in Kansas. And we figured out a way to make a loan and make that happen. In a place where that access is desperately needed, right? And I noticed how critical the role of finance and capital is, and the role of public companies is in terms of making change that is felt on issues that are material to many, many of us. So that's how I ended up here doing this work.
I love it. This is going to be a good conversation. So I want to start off on a little bit of a positive note. So we're actually seeing that women's labor force participation rates have actually, really rebounded since the pandemic. I think it's something like 77.5% of prime age women are working in the workforce now, which is a huge achievement when you consider where we were at on the onset of the pandemic and the many, many layoffs that women have faced. And so, but that brings up a whole host of other challenges, especially when we talk about wraparound supports. And that includes things like childcare and family leave, sick leave. As we all know, the US is one of the few industrialized countries that still doesn't have those kind of supports as part of, sort of federal programs. So kind of an interesting world that we're living in, to Mega's point. So I want to maybe throw this open to the entire panel to kind of kick us off here. It's interesting. We sort of rely so much on employers for many of these benefits. And, everything from our health care to childcare and certainly, our sick leave and things like that. And I'm curious, what you guys are seeing in the workplace right now on how workers and employers are sort of, quite frankly, making this work or not. I'm curious to get everyone's thoughts here. Dara, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that first. I think the real question is, what do we owe to each other, right, in a world of at-will employment? What do we owe to our employers, and what do our employers owe to us as their best and most practical asset, right? What I think is interesting about a place like Amalgamated Bank, which is a labor-founded financial institution, still majority labor-owned, is that we've embedded the principles that we want to live behind into our day-to-day practice, right? All of our loans are going towards affordable housing, community care, healthcare, climate and solar. They're not going into payday lenders, oil and gas pipelines, weapons and ammunition manufacturers, which I think speaks to, talking about the concept of reproductive justice. Where do we see these values coming into play from employers? First, right, I think it's the right to not have a child, right? Access to abortion and contraception. Then it's certainly the right to have a child as well, right? So we should expect the full spectrum of benefits from IUI and IVF to adoption and surrogacy support to much, much more, right? But also the right to have that child and to be able to parent in a safe and healthy environment, which brings to bear every single other issue of the day, right? From climate to gun control to good education and housing. And I think we can and should ask more from our employers, but also from the companies that we patronize, right, with our dollars, and that choosing to support organizations and companies that are supporting that full spectrum of what a just reproductive life should look like is powerful. And I think that more and more companies are going to have to see that that's essential to not just retaining employees, but clients as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So I love you offering this stat around women's labor force participation surpassing pre-pandemic levels. The thing that I think about is, okay, what does that mean then, right? So then we've got to be thinking about, how do we support these women? How are we thinking about advancement? How are we thinking about the wraparound supports that you mentioned? I want to talk about pay equity for a second, okay? So the pay gap is just such a persistent issue. I have a stat here I just want to call out, was a women earning 84 cents on the dollar compared to men. Women of color earning far less, right? So African American women earning 63 cents and Latina women earning 55 cents. For every dollar earned by a white man. You think about that disparity, it is huge. There's a new Center for American Progress analysis that came out that I think said that since the Equal Pay Act in the 1960s, working women are basically at a loss of $2.1 trillion. That is insane to me. So I think about, yes, amazing that there's women back in the workforce, but are we, is remote work, are we going to keep those policies? Are we still going to be thinking about the flexibility that people need? Are we going to be offering subsidies around childcare? So that's what I think about. It's not enough to kind of hit some of these stats, and I think it's really about how do we thread that needle full to really be driving equity in the workplace. So those are some of the things that keep me up at night. Last thing I'll say on the pay equity piece. The other thing about this study was that the gap, they said the gap's not going to close till 2056. So I did that math. Let's do that math. That's 30 years. My daughter is going to be 33 at that point. I mean, this is not what I want for her. So it's not enough. It's great what we've done, and it's also not enough. And I think that's just a motivator for how we kind of keep going.
I think the opportunity we have before us is the crisis of the shortage for talent as well. And so it's causing employers to think differently about services and benefits if you want a more diverse workforce or if you want talent in particular. And I know there's a tension now around what return to work looks like. And I think if you're really serious about building a diverse, competitive workforce, it's in a real sense, forcing employers to grapple with those questions of what does it mean to support women? What does flexibility look like, et cetera?
I want to take that one step further. So, we've been hearing now for nigh on 24 months. This is the most predicted recession that we are still not in, but certainly we are seeing a ton of layoffs in a number of segments and industries, certainly tech layoffs, but we've certainly seen this in finance as well. And of course, when push comes to shove, a lot of times the employer mindset does, sort of subsist on a budget. And so when budgets are pulled back, when they are constrained, a lot of times these programs, these benefits do get reined in. And I'm curious what your thoughts are around what we're going to see if we do end up experiencing an economic downturn.
It's a great question. I mean, to your point, the things that get cut are usually those that get cut first. I think there are a couple of opportunities here, and so no reason to think that will be that will be different this time around. I think there are a couple of opportunities, though, I won't say hold the reins, but one, so much of this comes down to the manager and the experience that the manager provides. So there's not a hard benefit there, but I think that understanding and that flexibility can go a long way in terms of what the experience is to kind of make up for any benefits that get costs. And they're not to equate them as being one and the same, because they're certainly not. Those needs and benefits are those needs. But I think there's also opportunity there that's not monetary in nature, just because time is our most precious commodity. And the second thing I'm seeing, although the uptick isn't there yet, is providers, both nonprofit and for-profit, who are who have this kind of one-on-one service support around benefits, that they can give feedback to employers about which benefits are in demand and which ones aren't, and what employees are needing right now. So I think the extent to which we pay attention to that could also help ease some of the things that might be easiest to be on the chopping block, because we're getting the feedback that's necessary that these things actually matter. And even though they may seem fringe, margin, they're not. So I'm taking an unusually optimistic approach today. But again, in all seriousness, I do think there's opportunity there, but we're going to have to fight for it, as we always have.
I like that. I like the optimism. Meg, I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier around your daughter. And so, as a working mom, I'm suspecting that you're familiar with the motherhood penalty that we hear a lot about. I mean, there's been a number of recent studies and research that has shown that so many moms did take career pauses during the pandemic. Those are folks are maybe still on pause. I think something like 58% of moms take on primary responsibilities in their household, even when they are the breadwinner in some cases, and 52% of working moms, so this is over half, say that the cost of childcare has made them consider leaving the workforce. I mean, these are really staggering numbers when you really think about it in the macro sense. And I'm curious, where are some of the biggest holes that you're seeing in the system, as a mother, as someone who is sort of thinking about things through this lens?
Yeah, you're speaking to me now. I get it. Yeah, I'm going to try to channel your optimism too, actually, because there's a lot we could talk about with problems. So maybe what I'll highlight are things that employers could be doing to really best support and show up for women and mothers and really parents in today's workplace. So, I mean, again, we just talked about the pay equity gap. So equal pay, I think, is a huge one. There's ways to do this around, you're auditing your own internal mechanisms, you're thinking about equity and doing those reviews, you're transparent around salaries, which we know we've seen a lot of laws, and there's mixed results about how that's going, of course, but salary transparency is one. So I think equal pay just has to be at the forefront of how employers are thinking about this. I'd also think about mentorship and sponsorship. So coming back to the consulting example, I actually had some great male sponsors when I was a consultant, and they would kind of open the door and then kind of like get out of the way for me, which was amazing, right? Because they were using their position and power and privilege to, help me realize my own potential. And they saw that potential, and they really enabled that. So I think there's something around sponsorship programs to really be supporting women in the workplace when you think about actually advancing and advancement opportunities. And then I'm just going to come back to what you highlighted earlier about wraparound supports. And this is where I do see the gaps. So parental leave policies for both spouses or for both partners. It's not just enough to offer it for a mother or a birth giver in the workplace. It has to be for both because it's a signaling mechanism, and it's demonstrating that household care and caregiving is not just a woman's responsibility. So that's sort of one to think about. And that's where I see a gap, actually. In a lot of companies, they'll offer, my husband had 4 weeks, and that was a lot for the world of finance, and that's a shame that that's a lot. So those are a couple of thoughts, and the last one I'll just highlight is around childcare. And let me tell you, that struggle is real. Just this morning, we got a text from the person that we have watching our child in the middle of the day, couldn't come in. My husband had to cancel all of his meetings. Of course he did. He did it. But, just thinking about those gaps, those deserts that exist where childcare, you don't have access to it. I think I'm on wait lists for about 2 years. Right, to get into a daycare, and then even then. So there's just more we need to be doing at a macro level around the childcare play to make it really infrastructure and build in. That is an equity play, and that'll really support women, mothers, all parents in the workplace.
I want to go back a little bit to pay equity because I want to make sure we hit this really hard here. I think most of us, almost every woman in the workforce has at least sat there and had the advice handed to her at some point where, well, you just need to negotiate better for your salary. And there have been workshops around this. And, it seems to be, a very big craze for your employer to sponsor these workshops. And I'm not sure that it's doing anything. We've sort of seen the sort of the gender pay gap, really flatline. We haven't seen a lot of, progress here. What do you think it's going to take to actually get progress? Is that helpful advice in this day and age? What should employers be doing instead, perhaps? And Megan, I want to start with you and then open it up because I see lots of head nodding on this one.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. We're gonna waver on that. It's such a great question, and I really, So I'm going to cite a study again. There's a study, I can't remember, there's Journal of Economy and Society, I think, that talks about that women are actually, given the chance, just as likely to want to negotiate as men. The problem is that opportunity doesn't always exist, right? And so I think that's where employers need to be stepping up, is actually making that known and available. So for example, we talked about these pay transparency laws, which actually, it's not just about making that known for all. There's a signaling mechanism there that when this is possible and that the opportunity exists to actually bring that up, cite what other people are making, that can go a long way in actually making the tactics around negotiation play out in their favor. So I think part of it's just making those opportunities aware. I think the other thing is getting rid of salary histories, right? And I think we mentioned this earlier, right? That you can't be basing your compensation or what you're offering someone on what they previously used to make. And this goes beyond just women, by the way. Like, this is a huge equity. It has huge equity implications because you think about being underpaid once and that affects your lifelong earning potential. I mean, now you start to see where this wage gap and the $61 trillion, kind of gap comes into play. So I would say that's another area that I would be very bullish on, is stop basing employee pay on salary history and start considering the workforce for the potential they have, the skills they have. I think, Tyra, you brought up the skills angle, and make that part of your compensation strategy.
Do you think that negotiating your pay is a bit of a privilege, though? I mean, there are a number of jobs in our workforce today where I don't think the workers would ever even think that they have the opportunity, and quite frankly, they don't have the opportunity to negotiate. If you're working a minimum wage job, that is the pay, and you don't really have the position to perhaps negotiate. So I'm kind of curious, Tyra, you're nodding very, very, very vehemently here, so I want to get to you.
It is such an excellent point. It is a privilege. And sometimes we have the privilege and don't exercise it. We're concerned about how it will be perceived. There are a myriad of reasons why we don't, and there's a large segment that does not have that privilege. And the piece that's sticking out to me is employers have the data, like, period, full stop. So if you do the work, if you care about this, I did this in my last job at New America, if you care about it, you look at the data and you really try to understand what's driving the differences, and you make that right, like, full stop, plain and simple. So that to me is like forget putting it, not forget, but let's minimize putting the onus on the individual himself or herself who has almost no insight into that data that employers have, and let's put the responsibility and the pressure on employers to behave differently and be able to justify those differences. I was just in a board meeting last week, and they showed raw cut data. They had done the work of what women versus men make. It was quite close. It was anywhere from like 88 cents to 98 cents even. And then I said, what's the percentage? But this is at a board level. Okay, so what's the percentage of women to men? Because if you tell me like 80% women and 20% men, that is unacceptable. And I also sat there and said, 97 cents is really close, but it's not $1. And so let us not be content that it's closer than anyone else, but that it's not $1, or it's not even, I'll take $1.05, right? On the flip side, as part of that. But again, I just can't underscore the responsibility that I think employers have to pay attention to this issue. It's really, really hard having done it, and yet it's critical.
I'm very pro salary negotiation when you have the privilege to do that. And also hearing that we still talk about it this way makes me incensed, because it's the same thing as saying folks can fix climate change just by not using straws, right? We are looking at trying to solve a structural issue using personal culpability when something like the US military, for example, right, is the major polluter. And we're not talking about that. We're instead talking about, my straw consumption. So that feels upsetting, right? Because we're basically displacing blame and accountability onto individuals, as opposed to the folks who are holding these massive levers of power and whose minute shifts actually have huge implications. Yeah, makes me furious. I did also want to circle back to this really interesting question about a recession that we maybe are already in. And talk a little bit about employee resource groups and creating internal buy-in, right? So employee resource groups are ERGs. I'm the head of the Amalgamated Bank LGBTQ Employee Resource Group. And it's really helpful when you can get employees together who are parts of Amalgamated or union. Some folks are unionized who are part of the ERG, but this is a non-union entity, right? This is just something that the employer has created as a space for employees to come together on issues that are material to their identities, right? And we can use that as a platform to advocate for things that we need. And we can also use things like the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, which has recently, this is the first year in 20 years, I think they've updated it, but they are finally asking for full family formation benefits to be offered, right? This is something like a rising tide, right? This is a curb cut, which is made for, folks in wheelchairs, but helps people with strollers and folks who are carrying grocery bags, right? This is something that is a small lift that makes a huge impact for folks. So even when we're looking at solutions that are geared towards a particular demographic, right, they help every single person. And I think we need to look at more solutions like that as well.
I want to stay on Amalgamated Bank for 1 second, because when we're sitting there and talking about corporate solutions, I think we've certainly seen a lot around, issues in the past, year and a half around reproductive rights, certainly access to healthcare, women's healthcare. And, I'm curious how you guys have sort of approached that and sort of, from the ground up, built these programs that not only seem to, provide real practical solutions, but seem to have sort of embody a little bit of a value proposition and what, the employer is actually standing for. And so I'm curious if you can, provide some insights and give a little bit of a feel on sort of what that looks like and what that process looks like.
For sure. I think we're really lucky in that we have this kind of baked into who we are. So Amalgamated was founded 100 years ago by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. So as union folks in the garment district, led by Sidney Hillman, they weren't being served by the traditional banks. JP Morgan said, you're too poor. Essentially, I don't want to bank you. So the labor union created a bank, and it has grown from serving all of these individuals and workers to continue to serve individuals today, but also has grown a massive practice in serving strike funds, labor unions, foundations, nonprofits, political campaigns. And so we're certainly blessed to have that baked into the DNA of who we are as being a worker-founded financial institution. But also, we see really clearly why this benefits us and the bottom line, right? We hear a lot in a bunch of impact investing spaces about triple bottom line, quadruple bottom line, right? We believe that you can do well and do good at the same time, and that has proven in our business model, where last year we had 2 consecutive quarters that were the most profitable in the bank's history. And we do that by coming out strong on gun control. We do that by coming out strong on access to abortion and reproductive health care rights. We do that by coming out strong on climate and the responsibilities of financial institutions to find solutions to climate change instead of funding more oil and gas pipelines. And we believe that this creates a business model that attracts and retains employees who care about these issues. So it's definitely about talent. But we also believe that it creates a pull for our clients. And all of these things that we work on are not just because we think it's a good idea. I always think we should do things because they're a good idea and they are the moral and ethical thing to do. And also, I understand that we need to do a business case, and we have been able to make the business case for why putting into practice these lived values is good for the bottom line and is actually responsive to our clients who are all working in these fields so that we're not actively working against them, and is also responsible to our shareholders and to the world at large.
So along that same line, over the course of the Dobbs decision and the many discussions that we've had around it, there's this idea that sort of has become a little bit more front and center that reproductive rights are an economic issue, and that there are effects on economic mobility. Megan, I'm curious here, connect the dots for us a little bit on what that really means in practice and sort of where we're sort of sitting right now.
Yeah, reproductive rights are an economic issue, like full stop, right? So we know this, that 1 in 4 working women will have an abortion in their lifetime. So you think about that, we look around the room, I mean, that's huge, right? We know that women who do not have access to abortion care are 3 times more likely to leave the workforce, 4 times more likely to have a household income below the federal poverty line. That's an economics issue. This adds up. So state abortion laws are costing $105 billion annually in reduced labor force participation, productivity, reduced earnings. That's an economics issue, right? The implications of this are also far greater for women of color, Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous populations who often live in states that have the most restrictive policies around abortion coverage, are potentially predisposed to certain adverse health outcomes, and someone mentioned earlier, may work in jobs that don't have the travel flexibility or the wages or family circumstances to really support what has happened. So that's an economics issue, right? And the last thing I want to highlight is it's also, you see massive repercussions of this on education and workforce. You see this on playing out in decisions about where people want to go to school, where they want to live. This is much bigger than politics, and this has real implications around equity. We think about this at JFF a lot around the populations that we really care about, that we want to work with, that we do work with and work for and serve. Because if this plays out, we're talking about massive amounts of people not being able to really advance in their careers, access the supports they need, and thrive. And that again is an economic issue. So yeah, you said it right.
I can't take credit for this. Obviously, this idea has been out there a bit, but I am sort of looking at the landscape. We've certainly seen a number of employers respond, in varying different ways here about providing support systems, about not only, in terms of benefits, but also, for workers who are potentially in some of these more disputed states. Curious, what happens now? how do we move this forward? What do we expect to see from employers in terms of support? What do we need to see from employers in terms of support?
I'll just offer a couple things, and I'll open up to Tyra and to Dara. So 1 month after the Dobbs decision, I think less than 10% of companies had even made a public statement, and many of those were also around travel benefits. Travel benefits are great, and they're not enough. We know that oftentimes women who have abortions, they have other children. These are already mothers. And so if you don't have the childcare in place, the infrastructure in place to be able to avail yourself of that travel benefit, it is not enough, right? There's a survey that came out from Catalyst you reported on this, Megan. It came out from Catalyst, I think in the fall, right? Talking about how 44% of the respondents want to see their employers doing more around abortion access. And these are not my words, but half of younger employees don't think their companies are doing enough. 2/3 of those employees, and again, these are not my words, but characterize their employers' responses as performative and without real substance. So that again I loved your point earlier about you have to be listening to your workers and talking to them and understanding their needs. You hear that kind of stat, and you hear how you put out a travel benefit, but then this is what your employees are saying. It's because it's not enough, right? And you're making something available. It requires the full spectrum of accountability on that front, and I think that's where employers could be doing more. I'm wondering, I know Dara's got a lot to say on this topic.
Sure, I'll just add that, right, I hadn't heard that about post-Dobbs because that feels foreign to me, and that Amalgamated 2 months before we got the decision had put out our policy on what we were going to do, and noting that we would cover not only plane, gas, hotel, meals, but also childcare support, and if you needed to bring a dependent to travel with you, because many folks who need to access abortion care already have kids. I think what we want to see, right, is not just the performance and not just having this benefit go away, and also utilizing more mechanisms to advocate for better policies. These are many companies have signed up to join the Don't Ban Equality campaign, right, which brings together many companies who are all out there using their corporate voice to advocate for reproductive healthcare rights at the state and federal and local level. And we need to see more of that. We also need to see more of the amazing work that's being done by the Reproductive Health Investors Alliance, which are submitting shareholder proposals, which is a really fascinating and sneaky way to try and get companies to do better on this, right? To hold them really publicly accountable on what they're going to do, not just now and in this real moment of need, but also moving forward, because it's going to, not to be depressing, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I love what you highlight about how you all 2 months before it came out, same thing with JFF, right? When the decision was leaked, a lot of internal conversation and a lot of support for we need to support our employees on this front. So I think that's something that people can be doing more. There are other things on the horizon that we need to be thinking about around employer response here. So we know the Supreme Court is looking at affirmative action right now. There's conversations around what employers, how this might affect and show up in the workplace, for example. There's other populations that we talk about where we perceive and know and feel that rights are being threatened. And so this is, I think, where employers can be doing more. And I do also want to highlight, that doesn't mean, I know we have this call to action, do more, do more. It's also a recognition that there's a lot going on. It's a very complicated climate. And we do know that employers are doing a lot on this front. So I just want to underscore the point that this is not to say it's not, enough per se. It's just, maybe it is to say it's not enough, but it's not to highlight that there's no action at all, because I just want to underscore that we know the complexity of these issues, and we know when you think about the constituents that you're serving and the interplay of all these different, players in the ecosystem.
I'm glad you said that, because I'm sitting with that point as well of, I think the question that I was sitting with is, what does the village look like? And is it employer partnerships? Is it employees themselves? Is it the local community? But I do think to your point, there's probably more to be done. And I think, what does the larger ecosystem need to look like around this issue is what I'm sitting with.
I like the ecosystem aspect on that, and I want to, follow up on that a little bit because, this is one part of a larger umbrella around family building supports. It's a larger umbrella around, gender equity in the workplace. And so, there's an intersectionality on a lot of these topics. And, I think it can be difficult for both employers and employees to try to navigate that. To your point, there's a lot going on right now. I'm curious, for Dara, you've had some experience in this, like, how do you start these discussions? So, you mentioned like ERG groups and things like that, but I'm sort of curious, we do put the onus on workers a little bit to speak up and to tell their employers when they do need additional benefits, when they, do need additional supports, but how do you get that conversation rolling?
I just start. Right, that's the only way to do it, is you have to start. There was a really wonderful speaker yesterday who noted, right, you just have to go do it, right? And that is what it is. And that is also, let me also step back and talk about privilege for a second, right? And that I am the head of the employee resource group for LGBTQ folks at Amalgamated. I also am a white woman who is in one of the major business lines of the institution. I feel, knock on wood, if anyone's watching or listening, relatively personally safe about going to HR and our DEI head and not asking, but demanding what I think my fellow employees and myself are owed, right? I can build coalitions, and I do, right? And I also try to use my relative place of privilege within this institution to utilize these conversations as jumping off points. I think it's important, right, to include as many voices as possible and also recognize who can take the hit and who can't take the hit. Because we do put the onus on workers, but we have to look at who is actually taking up the mantle of responsibility and potentially the pushback or retribution, as in the case maybe for many, many folks who are going to advocate for this. And it's internal coalition building for sure, but it's also external coalition building. And as often as you can make the business case for this, like, and I get to utilize and leverage things like our corporate equality index score, right? And that there are many other potential sort of business badges coming out for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights, for climate, and being able to both utilize worker power in a way that feels safe for the workers who can participate in this, but also utilize the business case and any outside leveraging that might be able to make this not just something that is on HR's plate that they have to deal with, but makes it a priority for them.
That makes sense. This is probably a good segue then into the topic around allyship and the importance of this. And it's not, of course, just, male colleagues that can be allies. It's, across the spectrum and really, to your point, bringing in that coalition. But, what are we sort of seeing in this space? What are sort of emerging trends? And I'm opening this up to the entire panel. How are you thinking about allyship in 2023? At once.
Well, it's a good question. I think part of it is, I really love what you're saying about kind of checking your privilege, seeing relative positioning, for example, where one might sit in a company, and then thinking about how to use that in a different way. So I will actually come back to like the topic of like men as allies. We saw a lot happen on the Hill recently with the confirmation hearings, and you saw a lot of men with like babies strapped to them and like talking about this. And there was one part of me that was like, well, this isn't new. I mean, there's a lot of women that do this all the time, but also it really helped get the conversation going. And I thought that was fantastic. And so sometimes it doesn't matter where it's coming from as long as it's working towards the same outcome and the same goal. So I actually really I enjoyed that a lot, because I do think there's a responsibility for, and as you mentioned, for those of us in positions of privilege, power, and often influence, to try and channel that towards the common goals that we're identifying. The other thing that I think about is again, particularly about men as allies, so we can broaden that in a second, but is the household responsibility and the caregiving responsibility. So we talk a lot about this as if like it just give her more time and she can go home and clean. That's not, I mean, that's not the solution, right? And so normalizing and making more, I guess normal and consistent that men have that responsibility and that duty at home as well is part of it. My, again, childcare woes. We had our baby at home. We had to figure it out. My husband's sitting there on a Zoom call with the baby on his lap, and he's like, "Yeah, people love it." And I'm like, "Well, of course they love it. How cute, right?" It's just not the same. But what I love of what he's doing is he's trying to normalize it. He's like, my childcare is out. My wife's in a meeting. I mean, this is my responsibility now. So we talk a lot about this at home, about how do we balance and share that responsibility, because it does not just fall on me. It falls on us as our unit, and it falls on us as all of us in positions of power, privilege, and influence to think about that for people who can't always advocate for that positioning.
I'm thinking a similar thought where I had a male leader who moved to Seattle just about a year ago and has not found childcare. I think his son is 2, and wife was going out of town, and I said, "Oh, bring the baby in." And then I was like, so and so loves babies. I'm like, well, I'll just take care of him. But how much does a woman get to do that? And quite frankly, how much does he get to do of that? So, if there's nothing else apparent from this panel, is what a big issue child care is in our country. I also think about, and you alluded to this just now, of the allyship being beyond men. So I am a single woman who does not have kids of my own. And I think about what it means for me to be an ally to people who do have full families and people who do have partners and kids, and how do I show up as a leader? I both want to model the way, so I'm not leaving to take care of my kids, but I'm leaving to have dinner. Yeah. I'm leaving to work out. Yeah. And so that sense of priority is really, I think, what we can and should be modeling. And when we do that, I remember also, this is like unrelated, but it's really stuck out to me. I was working at the U.S. Department of Education under President Obama, and I somehow learned, I think because I was like friends with the security guys, so Secret Service, that the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, at the time would sometimes use his lunchtime to go play sports, get in a workout. And I was like, well, if he can take a break, then surely I can take a break. So it was such a, again, totally different issue, but it was such an important signaling moment to me that I think about, again, how do all of us, but especially leaders and managers, show up as people that then gives everyone the space, is, I think, what true allyship looks like across the board.
I love both of these statements. I also want to add that again, not to hammer the point, but I think allyship just comes back to privilege, right? And recognizing when and where you stand up. I never expected that I would be talking to the executive team about how much a vial of sperm costs. But I have been, because my partner and I don't have the genetic material needed to create a child without that. That's $1,000 a pop, fun fact. Not to mention storage costs. Not to mention you probably need at least 3 vials per insemination attempt, right? And part of that allyship is about education, right? How much education is the onus on me to do the education for my HR team to know what actually we need, right? When we go to our employers and say, here's what I need, do you have to go out there and do all the research yourself as to what, and educate folks internally who are in the positions of power to make the material financial decisions about this as to what this is actually going to cost us? And the answer is sometimes, yeah, you do. And sometimes that is best taken from learned experience. And sometimes I think that allyship can and should be me not having to do that work. And having other folks be proactive on this, where that is not an issue that is maybe personally material to them, but that they have enough empathy, compassion, intelligence to recognize what actually needs intelligence about how much sperm costs. They need to know it because it's expensive. I think that would be really meaningful, not just to me personally, but to all of our employees, right? And that is, I think the communication around just empathy from those in power making decisions who might have nannies at home, as we were talking about this morning, and who can afford, private and home childcare versus those who are running out to pick up their kids from a daycare that's about to close, is a really different consideration.
Can I just jump in on one point? I just want to underscore one thing. Both
realize that you're standing between people and lunch. So
I got it. One quick point.
One quick point.
What I love about what you two are highlighting is just the importance of understanding the whole human experience at work. And so what you are experiencing in your home life, it matters in a way that, the way that your employer can show up for you, it is different. I'm so glad you brought up single, no kids, because I remember experiencing that too. Like, why do people with kids get to do this or that? Like, I want to sign off to go to a yoga class. You should be able to, right? So I'm really grateful that you brought that point up, because so much of our conversation is talking about what people do, have in their home lives. Home life is a variety of things to a variety of people, and we need to be showing up for all of those experiences.
I love that. Well, I think that this has been a really great discussion. I know that we could probably sit here for another 3 hours or so and continue to do this. But before we wrap, any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with, any call to action, anything else before I promise I'll cut you off?
Thanks for coming, and tell all of your employers and friends to look at full family formation benefits, and that this is going to become the norm and best practice.
Yeah, I guess what I'll leave with is just, this is a fight. It's kind of, it can feel really heavy sometimes, but just on the note of optimism, I do believe that things are better. They are better than they ever have been, and there is more work to do.
And I think what's coming up for me that we haven't talked about is also just the importance of feedback and dialogue, because sometimes it is not a misintentioned or malintentioned, but without the awareness and the feedback as well on the problem as well as the solution side, I think is a way that we can all show up.
Very nice. Well, give a round of applause to our fabulous speakers. Thank you guys so much.